On a cold January morning in 2025, as King Charles III sat in his private study at Windsor Castle reviewing the morning papers, he had no idea that the year ahead would test the British monarchy like no other period in modern history. The headlines that day seemed routine: economic challenges, political debates, the usual royal engagements planned for the week. But, hidden beneath the surface of this apparent normalcy, forces were already in motion that would rock the very foundations of the thousand-year-old institution. What started as whispered conversations in palace corridors would soon explode into international headlines. Secret meetings that began behind closed doors would ultimately play out on the world stage. Personal family dramas would become constitutional crises. And decisions made in private royal apartments would send shockwaves through governments, media organizations, and millions of royal watchers around the globe. This is the untold story of 12 months that changed everything, a year when ancient traditions collided with modern realities, when family loyalty was tested against public duty, and when the monarchy faced questions about its very survival. From boardrooms in London's financial district to living rooms in Commonwealth nations, from social media platforms to parliamentary debates, the events of 2025 would force everyone to ask a fundamental question: in our rapidly changing world, what is the future of the British royal family? The answers that emerged would surprise even those closest to the palace walls. This is that story, raw, unfiltered, and more dramatic than any fictional tale Hollywood could imagine. The first sign that 2025 would be unlike any other year in royal history came not from an official announcement or a grand ceremony, but from a seemingly innocent social media post. Princess Catherine, the Princess of Wales, had shared what appeared to be a routine family photo on Instagram. The image showed her 3 children playing in the gardens of Kensington Palace, their laughter frozen in time by the camera. But keen-eyed royal watchers noticed something troubling in the background. Behind the children, barely visible through a palace window, was King Charles himself. He appeared to be in an animated discussion with someone just out of frame. His usually composed demeanor seemed strained, his hands gesturing in a way that suggested tension rather than casual conversation. Within hours, the image had been analyzed by thousands of eagle-eyed fans who began speculating about what they were witnessing. The palace's initial response was swift and predictable. A spokesperson dismissed any concerns, explaining that the king had simply been discussing routine matters with his private secretary. But those closest to the royal family knew better. The truth was far more complex and potentially damaging than anyone could have imagined at the time. 3 weeks earlier, in a secure meeting room deep within Buckingham Palace, King Charles had received a briefing that would haunt him for months to come. The head of royal security had presented findings from a comprehensive review of the family's financial arrangements, public perception ratings, and long-term sustainability projections. The numbers painted a troubling picture that contradicted the public image of a stable, beloved institution. Public support for the monarchy, while still substantial, had been steadily declining among younger demographics. More concerning was the growing sentiment in several Commonwealth nations about reconsidering their constitutional ties to the British Crown. Australia's Labor government had quietly begun preliminary discussions about holding another referendum on becoming a republic. Canada's Prime Minister had made carefully worded statements about evolving relationships with the Crown. Even in traditionally loyal New Zealand, opinion polls showed a generational divide that threatened the monarchy's future relevance. But the real bombshell in that January briefing wasn't about public opinion or constitutional questions. It was about money. The royal family's financial structure, built over decades of careful planning and investment, was facing unprecedented challenges. Inflation had eroded the real value of the sovereign grant, while maintenance costs for royal properties had skyrocketed. The Crown estate, long considered the golden goose of royal finances, was facing pressure from environmental groups and government regulations that threatened its profitability. King Charles, who had spent his entire life preparing for this role, found himself confronting problems that his mother, Queen Elizabeth II, had never faced. The world had changed dramatically during her 70-year reign, but the monarchy's basic structure remained largely unchanged. Now, less than 3 years into his reign, Charles was being forced to consider reforms that would have been unthinkable just a generation earlier. The pressure wasn't just coming from external sources. Within the royal family itself, cracks were beginning to show. Prince William, heir to the throne, had been quietly pushing for modernization efforts that went far beyond what his father felt comfortable implementing. The younger generation of royals, led by William and Catherine, believed that the monarchy needed to adapt dramatically to survive. They argued for reducing the number of working royals, streamlining operations, and taking more progressive stances on social issues. Catherine herself had become an unexpected voice for change within the family. Her background as a commoner who had married into royalty gave her a unique perspective on how ordinary people viewed the institution. She had commissioned private polling that revealed troubling trends in public perception. Young people, in particular, saw the monarchy as increasingly irrelevant to their lives. Many viewed the royal family as an expensive anachronism that consumed public resources while offering little in return. These internal discussions had been carefully hidden from public view, but they were becoming increasingly heated. Family dinners at Windsor Castle, once pleasant social occasions, had become tense affairs where fundamental questions about the monarchy's future dominated conversation. Princess Anne, known for her direct manner, had bluntly told her brother that the institution needed a bloody revolution, not evolution, to remain relevant. The pressure was also mounting from an unexpected source: the royal staff themselves. Longtime palace employees, many of whom had served the family for decades, were beginning to speak privately about their concerns. They had watched as workloads increased while budgets tightened. They had seen public criticism mount while their ability to respond was constrained by centuries-old protocols. Some of the most experienced staff members had begun quietly updating their resumes, preparing for what they feared might be inevitable downsizing. Meanwhile, the media landscape was changing in ways that made traditional royal public relations strategies obsolete. Social media had given everyone a voice in royal coverage, and not all of those voices were friendly. Conspiracy theories about royal finances, personal relationships, and political influence spread faster than palace communications teams could counter them. The old system of carefully managed relationships with established journalists was crumbling in the face of independent bloggers, influencers, and citizen journalists who operated outside traditional media structures. Foreign governments were also beginning to recalibrate their relationships with the British monarchy. The European Union, still smarting from Brexit complications, was less inclined to grant the royal family the ceremonial deference they had previously enjoyed. Other monarchies around the world were watching the British situation carefully, aware that any significant decline in the British crown's prestige could affect their own positions. King Charles was acutely aware that he had inherited not just a crown, but also a set of problems that had been building for years. His mother's long reign had provided stability, but it had also delayed necessary adaptations. Now, at age 76, he found himself trying to implement changes that should have begun decades earlier. The stress was beginning to show in ways that concerned his closest advisors. Charles had always been known for his attention to detail and his lengthy working days, but palace staff noticed that he seemed increasingly overwhelmed by the scope of the challenges facing the monarchy. His famous love of gardening and architecture, pursuits that had always provided him with relaxation, no longer seemed to offer the same respite. Catherine's innocent Instagram post had inadvertently captured a moment of this mounting pressure. The animated discussion visible in the background was actually King Charles receiving yet another briefing about declining poll numbers in Scotland, where support for both independence and republicanism was reaching new heights. The Scottish National Party had begun openly discussing what independence might mean for Scotland's relationship with the monarchy, and their conclusions were not encouraging for royal supporters. As January turned to February, these various pressures began to converge in ways that no one could have predicted. What had started as separate concerns about finances, public perception, family dynamics, and political relationships began to feed into each other, creating a crisis that was greater than the sum of its parts. The royal family's traditional approach to handling difficult periods had always been to maintain dignity, avoid public statements, and wait for problems to resolve themselves. But this strategy, effective for generations, was proving inadequate for the challenges of the modern world. Social media demanded immediate responses. 24-hour news cycles required constant engagement. Global audiences expected transparency and accountability in ways that traditional royal protocol had never contemplated. By the end of February, it was clear that 2025 would be a year of reckoning for the British monarchy. The question was no longer whether changes would be necessary, but how dramatic those changes would need to be. King Charles, who had waited his entire life to implement his vision for a modern monarchy, was discovering that the reality of reform was far more complex and, potentially dangerous than he had ever imagined. The seeds of what would become the most significant royal crisis in modern history had been planted. Now they were beginning to sprout, and no one could predict exactly what would grow from the fertile ground of uncertainty that surrounded the crown. March arrived with an unseasonably warm spell that brought early blooms to the gardens of Kensington Palace, but, inside the royal residences, the atmosphere was anything but spring-like. Prince William had reached a breaking point. The heir to the throne, typically diplomatic and measured in his approach to family matters, was preparing to take a stand that would fundamentally alter the trajectory of the monarchy. The catalyst for what palace insiders would later call the Prince's Rebellion was a leaked government memo that found its way to William's desk through channels that remain unclear to this day. The document, marked highly confidential and intended only for the Prime Minister's inner circle, contained a brutal assessment of the monarchy's financial burden on the British taxpayer and its diminishing value as a soft power asset for the United Kingdom. The memo, prepared by the Treasury's most senior economists, projected that maintaining the current royal structure would cost British taxpayers nearly £2 billion over the next decade, while delivering measurably declining returns in terms of tourism revenue, trade advantages, and diplomatic influence. More damaging still, the document suggested that several Commonwealth nations were actively planning to remove the British monarch as their head of state, potentially triggering a domino effect that could see the end of the Commonwealth as a meaningful political entity. William read the memo 3 times before its full implications sank in. This wasn't just about money or public relations. This was about the fundamental survival of the institution he was destined to inherit. The document made clear that without dramatic changes, he might one day become king of a greatly diminished realm, presiding over an institution that many of his subjects considered an expensive irrelevance. What happened next would have been unthinkable under previous generations of royal leadership. Instead of discussing the memo's contents privately with his father, William made a decision that would send shockwaves through the establishment. He called for an emergency family meeting and announced his intention to present what he termed a new vision for the monarchy directly to the government, whether his father approved or not. The meeting took place on a grey March afternoon in the Blue Drawing Room at Buckingham Palace. Present were King Charles, Queen Camilla, Prince William, Princess Catherine, Princess Anne, and Prince Edward. Notably absent was Prince Harry, whose relationship with the family remained strained following his departure from royal duties, but whose exclusion from this crucial discussion would later prove to be a significant miscalculation. William's presentation was methodical, passionate, and devastating in its implications for traditional royal protocol. He had prepared detailed charts showing declining public support across key demographic groups, financial projections that painted a bleak picture of the monarchy's economic future, and polling data from Commonwealth nations that suggested the institution's influence was in freefall. But William didn't stop at identifying problems. He presented a comprehensive reform program that he called Monarchy 2.0, a radical reimagining of how the royal family should operate in the modern world. His proposals included cutting the number of working royals by more than half, selling off lesser royal properties, implementing transparent financial reporting that would exceed what was legally required, and taking progressive positions on climate change, social justice, and economic inequality that would position the monarchy as a force for positive change rather than a guardian of tradition. The reaction around the room was explosive. Princess Anne, never one to mince words, accused her nephew of wanting to turn the monarchy into some sort of celebrity charity operation. Prince Edward worried that such dramatic changes would alienate traditional supporters without necessarily winning over younger demographics. Queen Camilla, speaking carefully but firmly, suggested that William was underestimating the value of stability and continuity in uncertain times. But it was King Charles's response that surprised everyone in the room. Rather than dismissing his son's proposals outright, the king listened intently and asked probing questions about implementation timelines and political feasibility. Those present later described a moment of profound tension when father and son locked eyes across the ornate room, each recognizing that they were discussing not just policy changes, but the fundamental nature of their relationship and their respective roles in the institution they both served. Catherine's support for her husband's position was crucial in shifting the family dynamic. The Princess of Wales had done her own research, commissioning private focus groups that revealed the depth of public skepticism about the monarchy's relevance. She presented findings that showed young mothers, a demographic traditionally supportive of the royal family, increasingly questioning whether the monarchy represented values they wanted to pass on to their children. The meeting stretched late into the evening, with heated exchanges that touched on everything from constitutional law to family loyalty. At one point, Princess Anne asked bluntly whether William was prepared to break with centuries of tradition based on a few bad polls and some Treasury bean counters spreadsheets. William's response was equally direct: "I'm prepared to break with tradition to save the institution. The question is whether you're prepared to let tradition destroy it." By the time the family members left the palace that night, it was clear that a fundamental shift had occurred. King Charles had not endorsed his son's proposals, but neither had he rejected them outright. Instead, he had agreed to establish what he called a commission of inquiry to examine the monarchy's future, a decision that would have far-reaching consequences no one could foresee at the time. The commission, announced to the public as a routine review of royal operations, was actually a revolutionary development. For the first time in history, the monarchy would conduct a systematic examination of its own relevance and effectiveness. The commission would include not just royal family members and palace staff, but also constitutional experts, economists, pollsters, and representatives from Commonwealth nations. News of the commission's formation leaked to the media within days, though the full scope of its mandate remained hidden. Royal correspondents, sensing a major story developing, began investigating the circumstances that had led to such an unprecedented review. Their digging uncovered hints of the family tensions that had prompted William's intervention, leading to a series of newspaper articles speculating about divisions within the royal household. The public reaction was swift and polarized. Traditional monarchists were alarmed by suggestions that fundamental changes might be coming, while Republicans and younger demographics expressed cautious optimism that the royal family might finally be acknowledging the need for reform. Social media exploded with competing hashtags. #modernize the monarchy and #preserve tradition began trending worldwide. International reaction was equally mixed but far more significant in its implications. The Australian government, already contemplating a Republican referendum, began openly discussing what changes to the British monarchy might mean for their own constitutional arrangements. Canadian Prime Minister's office issued a carefully worded statement about respecting the British people's right to determine their own constitutional arrangements while considering our own national interests. But it was the reaction from within the royal family's extended circle that proved most challenging to manage. Dozens of minor royals, aristocratic families with historic ties to the crown, and long-serving palace staff began expressing concerns about what reforms might mean for their own positions and privileges. Some threatened to go public with their opposition, potentially creating a damaging narrative about a royal family at war with itself. Prince Harry, observing these developments from his home in California, found himself in an unexpected position. His previous criticisms of the monarchy, once seen as disloyal attacks on the institution, suddenly seemed prescient. Media outlets began reaching out to him for comment on his brother's reform efforts, creating the possibility that Harry might become an unlikely ally in William's campaign for change. Meanwhile, behind palace walls, the real work of examining the monarchy's future was just beginning. William had assembled a team of trusted advisors who began conducting what amounted to a comprehensive audit of royal operations. They examined everything from the cost-effectiveness of state visits to the impact of royal patronages on charitable fundraising. They analyzed social media engagement rates, tourism statistics, and diplomatic reports that assessed the monarchy's value to British foreign policy. What they discovered was both more encouraging and more alarming than anyone had expected. On the positive side, the monarchy still commanded genuine affection and respect in many quarters, both domestically and internationally. Royal weddings and ceremonies could still capture global attention in ways that few other institutions could match. The soft power value of royal visits and endorsements remained significant, particularly in developing Commonwealth nations. But the negative findings were sobering. The monarchy's appeal was increasingly concentrated among older demographics, creating what researchers termed an aging support base with no clear succession strategy. Younger people didn't necessarily oppose the monarchy, but they were largely indifferent to it, seeing royal activities as irrelevant to their daily lives. More troubling still, focus groups revealed that many young adults viewed the royal family as symbols of inequality and privilege that contradicted their values about merit-based success and social justice. As spring progressed, it became clear that William's intervention had triggered something far larger than a simple review of royal operations. The Commission's work was uncovering fundamental questions about the monarchy's role in modern democracy, its relationship with former colonies seeking to address their colonial past, and its ability to represent an increasingly diverse British population. King Charles, observing his son's determined push for reform, began to recognize that William was preparing for a very different kind of kingship than anyone had previously imagined. The quiet prince who had dutifully followed royal protocol for decades was revealing himself to be a strategic thinker with radical ideas about institutional change. Whether those ideas would strengthen or destroy the monarchy remained to be seen, but one thing was certain: the British royal family would never be the same again. The crisis that would ultimately define the monarchy's entire year began not in London, but 8,000 miles away in the government buildings of Canberra, Australia. On a sweltering April morning, Prime Minister Anthony Albanese convened an emergency cabinet meeting that would send shockwaves through every Commonwealth nation and force the British royal family to confront their worst nightmare: the possible disintegration of the very institution that had defined their global relevance for generations. The immediate trigger was a series of leaked diplomatic cables that revealed the true extent of private discussions taking place between Commonwealth leaders about the monarchy's future. These cables, obtained by investigative journalists through Freedom of Information requests and whistleblower sources, painted a picture of growing impatience with what many leaders saw as Britain's inability to modernize an outdated institution. The most damaging cable came from Canada's Governor-General, who had written to Buckingham Palace expressing serious concerns about the sustainability of current arrangements following a series of public opinion polls showing that support for the monarchy in Canada had fallen below 40% for the first time in recorded history. The cable suggested that Canada might be forced to consider alternative constitutional arrangements if public sentiment continued to deteriorate. Similar messages had been sent from New Zealand, Jamaica, and Barbados. The pattern was unmistakable: Commonwealth nations were quietly preparing for a post-monarchical future, and they were beginning to coordinate their exit strategies rather than simply hoping for gradual reform from London. Prime Minister Albanese had been privately considering his options for months, but the leaked cables forced his hand. Public pressure in Australia for a republic referendum had been building steadily, fueled by a new generation of political leaders who had no personal connection to Queen Elizabeth II and who viewed King Charles as a distant figure with little understanding of Australian values and priorities. The economic arguments for cutting ties were becoming increasingly compelling. Australia's contribution to maintaining the monarchy through ceremonial costs, constitutional arrangements, and the Governor-General's office was estimated at nearly $50 million annually. More importantly, maintaining constitutional ties to Britain was seen by many Australians as an impediment to developing closer relationships with Asian trading partners who viewed the monarchy as a relic of colonialism. But Albanese's decision to move forward with a Republican referendum was about more than money or geopolitics. It was about identity. Australia in 2025 was a profoundly different nation from the one that had voted to retain the monarchy in 1999. The population was more diverse, more connected to Asia and the Pacific, and less sentimental about British traditions. Young Australians, in particular, struggled to understand why their head of state should be determined by an accident of birth in a country most of them had never visited. The announcement of the referendum, scheduled for October 2025, created immediate ripple effects across the Commonwealth. Within hours, political leaders in Canada were facing questions about their own plans. The Premier of Quebec, sensing an opportunity to advance separatist goals, announced that Quebec would hold its own referendum on the monarchy if Canada didn't act first. In New Zealand, the Prime Minister was forced to respond to reporters' questions about whether her government would follow Australia's lead. The reaction in London was swift and, by royal standards, unprecedented. Rather than issuing the usual diplomatic statements about respecting democratic processes, King Charles took the extraordinary step of announcing that he would personally travel to Australia to address the nation before the referendum vote. The decision alarmed palace advisors who worried that a royal intervention might backfire by reinforcing perceptions of the monarchy as out of touch and desperate to maintain relevance. Prince William, still pushing his modernization agenda within the family, saw the Australian crisis as validation of his warnings about the need for dramatic reform. In a heated family meeting, he argued that the monarchy's problems in the Commonwealth were symptoms of its failure to adapt to changing times. His solution was characteristically bold: the royal family should publicly support the Australian people's right to choose their own constitutional arrangements, while simultaneously announcing comprehensive reforms that would make the monarchy more appealing to other Commonwealth nations. The suggestion that the royal family should essentially accept the loss of Australia while trying to prevent further defections was seen by many traditionalists as tantamount to surrender. Princess Anne captured the mood of many senior royals when she declared that "we don't negotiate with constitutional terrorists." But William persisted, arguing that a dignified acceptance of Australia's decision, combined with meaningful reforms, would demonstrate strength rather than weakness. King Charles found himself caught between competing pressures that seemed to offer no clear path forward. His son's modernization program was gaining support among younger royals and some palace staff, but it was also generating fierce resistance from traditionalists who feared that any change would trigger an avalanche of demands for further concessions. Meanwhile, the Australian situation was forcing him to confront the possibility that his reign might be remembered primarily for the Commonwealth's collapse. The pressure intensified when unexpected support for the Australian position came from within Britain itself. A cross-party group of members of Parliament published an open letter arguing that Britain should gracefully accept the democratic will of Commonwealth nations rather than trying to pressure them to maintain outdated constitutional arrangements. The letter was signed by several prominent Conservative MPs, suggesting that even traditional supporters of the monarchy were beginning to question the wisdom of fighting to preserve arrangements that no longer commanded broad public support. But the real game-changer came from an unexpected source: Prince Harry. In a carefully worded statement issued from his California home, the Duke of Sussex expressed support for the democratic rights of all peoples to determine their own constitutional arrangements. While he stopped short of explicitly endorsing Australian republicanism, his statement was widely interpreted as a break with his family's position and a signal that even senior royals were questioning the monarchy's global role. Harry's intervention created a media firestorm that overshadowed every other royal story. British tabloids accused him of stabbing the monarchy in the back, while Republican voices praised him for choosing democracy over dynasty. The royal family's response was telling in its restraint. Rather than issuing a sharp rebuke, palace sources suggested that Harry's comments reflected personal views that didn't necessarily conflict with the family's position. The Australian Prime Minister, meanwhile, was discovering that his referendum announcement had unleashed forces beyond his control. Public debate in Australia became increasingly passionate, with Republican rallies drawing huge crowds while monarchist groups organized counter-demonstrations. The divide wasn't simply between Republicans and monarchists, but between different visions of what kind of nation Australia should become. Polling showed the Republican side ahead, but with support softer than referendum organizers had hoped. Many Australians supported the idea of a republic in principle but worried about the practical implications of constitutional change. Others felt genuine affection for King Charles personally, even while questioning the relevance of the monarchy as an institution. The complexity of public sentiment made the referendum outcome far from certain. The international implications of Australia's referendum were becoming increasingly clear as other nations watched the debate unfold. Caribbean nations that had already transitioned to Republican status were offering advice and support to the Australian Republican movement. African Commonwealth members were privately discussing whether they should follow Australia's lead in formally severing constitutional ties to Britain. Perhaps most significantly, the European Union was beginning to view the Commonwealth's potential fragmentation as an opportunity to strengthen its own relationships with former British colonies. EU trade negotiators quietly approached Commonwealth nations about preferential trading arrangements that might replace some of the economic benefits of Commonwealth membership. King Charles's planned visit to Australia became the focus of intense speculation about royal strategy. Palace sources suggested that the king would use his visit to highlight the monarchy's evolution and its commitment to serving modern Commonwealth nations. But critics argued that any royal intervention in the referendum campaign would be seen as inappropriate interference in Australian democracy. The visit, scheduled for June, would become a crucial test of whether the monarchy could adapt its traditional diplomatic approach to the realities of modern democratic politics. Palace planners found themselves navigating uncharted territory,
How does a monarch campaign for his own job without appearing desperate or undermining the very democratic principles that Commonwealth nations claim to value?
Meanwhile, back in London, William's Reform Commission was accelerating its work in response to the Commonwealth crisis. Commission members were meeting almost daily, examining everything from the role of governors-general to the future of royal patronage systems. Their interim findings suggested that maintaining the status quo was no longer an option, but they were struggling to identify reforms that would be dramatic enough to satisfy critics while preserving enough tradition to maintain the support of monarchist constituencies. The Commission's most significant finding was that the Commonwealth crisis wasn't really about the monarchy per se, but about post-colonial identity and the search for authentic national institutions. Commonwealth nations weren't rejecting King Charles personally, but rather the idea that their constitutional arrangements should be determined by their historical relationship with Britain rather than their contemporary values and aspirations. This insight led to perhaps the most radical proposal in the Commission's preliminary report, the idea of constitutional evolution that would allow Commonwealth nations to maintain symbolic connections to the monarchy while developing new forms of governance that reflected their unique national characters. The proposal was vague in its details but revolutionary in its implications, suggesting that the monarchy of the future might look nothing like the institution that had existed for centuries. As spring turned to summer, it became clear that the Australian referendum had triggered a fundamental re-evaluation of the monarchy's global role. The question was no longer whether the Commonwealth would change, but how quickly and how dramatically. King Charles, who had inherited what he thought was a stable international institution, was discovering that stability itself had become the monarchy's greatest vulnerability in a world that increasingly valued authenticity and democratic accountability over tradition and continuity. June arrived with an intensity that no one in the royal household had experienced in living memory. King Charles, facing the most significant constitutional crisis of his reign, made a decision that would either save the monarchy or accelerate its transformation beyond recognition. Against the advice of virtually every senior palace official, he chose to gamble everything on a strategy so risky that even his closest advisors questioned his judgment. The king's decision emerged from a private conversation with his eldest son that took place in the early hours of a June morning as both men walked through the gardens of Highgrove House. William had been pressing his father for weeks to embrace more dramatic reforms, but Charles had resisted, believing that gradual change was safer than revolutionary transformation. The Australian referendum campaign was intensifying daily, with polls showing the Republican side gaining momentum despite the monarchy's traditional advantages. What changed the king's mind was a confidential briefing from Britain's foreign intelligence services that painted an even bleaker picture than anyone had publicly acknowledged. The briefing revealed that several Commonwealth nations were coordinating their departure strategies, planning to announce their Republican transitions simultaneously to minimize the diplomatic fallout for any individual nation. More alarming still, the briefing suggested that some European monarchies were quietly considering whether they should distance themselves from the British Crown to protect their own positions. The intelligence assessment concluded that the traditional approach of quiet diplomacy and gradual reform would likely result in the Commonwealth's complete collapse within 18 months. The monarchy faced a stark choice: accept managed decline or attempt a dramatic transformation that might either revitalize the institution or accelerate its demise. Charles's gamble was breathtaking in its scope and audacity. He decided to announce a comprehensive reform program that would fundamentally restructure the monarchy's relationship with the Commonwealth, implement unprecedented transparency measures, and establish new mechanisms for democratic accountability. But the centerpiece of his strategy was the most controversial decision of all: he would use his planned visit to Australia to personally advocate for a reformed monarchy while simultaneously respecting the Australian people's right to choose their own future. The announcement, made in a televised address to the nation, shocked both supporters and critics of the monarchy. King Charles spoke directly to the camera from his study at Buckingham Palace, abandoning the formal tone typically associated with royal broadcasts in favor of a more personal and urgent delivery. He acknowledged that the monarchy faced legitimate questions about its relevance and effectiveness in the modern world and announced his intention to earn rather than assume the support of Commonwealth nations. The specific reforms he outlined were revolutionary by royal standards. The monarchy would publish detailed financial reports that exceeded legal requirements, implement term limits for certain royal patronages to ensure they remained effective rather than ceremonial, and establish citizen advisory councils in each Commonwealth realm to provide ongoing feedback about royal performance. Most significantly, Charles announced that future constitutional arrangements with Commonwealth nations would be subject to regular review, with referendums held every 25 years to ensure continued public support.
The reaction was immediate and explosive. Traditional monarchists accused the king of surrendering to Republican blackmail, while reform advocates questioned whether the proposed changes were sufficient to address fundamental concerns about hereditary privilege. The British press struggled to categorize Charles's announcement, with headlines ranging from King's constitutional revolution to royal family's desperate last stand. International reaction was equally divided but far more consequential. The Australian Prime Minister, caught off guard by the timing and scope of the King's announcement, was forced to recalibrate his referendum campaign strategy. Monarchist groups in Australia seized on the reforms as evidence that the monarchy could adapt to modern expectations, while Republicans argued that the proposed changes were cosmetic alterations that didn't address core issues about democratic governance. Behind the scenes, the royal family was experiencing internal tensions that threatened to tear apart the careful unity they had maintained during previous crises. Queen Camilla, while publicly supportive of her husband's decision, privately expressed concerns that the reforms might encourage demands for even more dramatic changes. Princess Anne was more direct in her criticism, telling family members that Charles had opened Pandora's box and might find it impossible to control the forces he had unleashed. But it was Prince Edward's reaction that proved most significant. The youngest of Charles's siblings had always been seen as the least politically minded member of the royal family, content to focus on his ceremonial duties and charitable work. His decision to publicly endorse his brother's reforms, issued through a carefully crafted statement, provided crucial family unity at a moment when division might have been catastrophic. The King's Australian visit, scheduled for late June, became the focal point of unprecedented international attention. Every aspect of the trip was analysed for its symbolic significance, from the King's choice of accommodation to his meeting schedule. Palace planners found themselves navigating completely uncharted territory. How does a monarch campaign for constitutional relevance without appearing to interfere inappropriately in democratic processes? Charles's strategy during the Australian visit was unlike anything previous royal tours had attempted. Rather than focusing on traditional ceremonies and formal meetings, the king scheduled town hall meetings, university debates, and community forums where ordinary Australians could question him directly about the monarchy's future role. The decision to submit to unrehearsed public questioning was seen by many observers as either courageous or foolhardy, depending on their political perspectives. The most memorable moment of the Australian visit came during a town hall meeting in Melbourne, where a university student asked the king directly whether he believed Australians should vote for or against the Republic referendum. Charles's response, delivered without notes or visible hesitation, would be quoted extensively in the weeks that followed. He told the student that he believed Australians should vote according to their values and aspirations for their nation's future, adding that the monarchy's role should be determined by its ability to serve those aspirations rather than by historical precedent or tradition. The answer satisfied neither monarchists, who wanted stronger advocacy for maintaining current arrangements, nor Republicans, who viewed it as an attempt to appear neutral while actually campaigning for the monarchy. But polling conducted immediately after the town hall meeting suggested that many Australians appreciated the king's willingness to engage directly with democratic questioning, even if they disagreed with his ultimate position. Media coverage of the Australian visit revealed the complexity of public sentiment about the monarchy in ways that previous polling had failed to capture. Many Australians expressed genuine personal respect for King Charles while maintaining doubts about the institution he represented. Others supported the idea of constitutional monarchy in principle while questioning whether the current arrangements adequately reflected Australian values and priorities. The visit's impact extended far beyond Australia itself. Other Commonwealth nations watched carefully to see how the reformed monarchy would function in practice. Caribbean leaders, many of whom had been considering their own republican transitions, began reassessing their timelines in light of the king's apparent willingness to accept democratic oversight of royal performance. But perhaps the most significant development during the Australian visit was Prince William's decision to join his father for the final days of the tour. The heir to the throne's presence was initially planned as a show of family unity, but William used the opportunity to outline his own vision for the monarchy's future in a speech to the Australian Parliament.
His address, delivered without palace approval and containing proposals that went beyond his father's reform program, signaled that the next generation of royals was prepared to implement even more dramatic changes. William's speech included a proposal for democratic monarchy that would subject royal performance to regular public evaluation and potentially allow for peaceful transitions to republican government if public support fell below specified thresholds. The proposal was so radical that palace officials initially tried to distance the king from his son's comments, before realizing that William's willingness to contemplate republican transitions might actually strengthen public confidence and royal commitment to democratic principles. The Australian visit concluded with mixed results that reflected the complexity of the constitutional questions at stake. Polling showed that public support for the monarchy had increased during the king's visit, but support for the referendum remained strong among voters who distinguished between personal respect for Charles and institutional support for hereditary monarchy. The visit had succeeded in demonstrating royal willingness to engage with democratic scrutiny, but it had not resolved fundamental questions about whether democratic accountability was compatible with hereditary privilege. As the royal party prepared to return to London, it was clear that Charles's gamble had changed the nature of the constitutional debate without necessarily determining its outcome. The monarchy had shown unprecedented willingness to adapt and evolve, but whether those adaptations would be sufficient to maintain Commonwealth unity remained uncertain. The flight back to London was subdued as both father and son contemplated the implications of what they had attempted in Australia. They had committed the monarchy to a path of continuous reform and democratic accountability that previous generations would have found unthinkable. Whether they had saved the institution or set in motion its fundamental transformation would become clear in the months ahead, as other Commonwealth nations evaluated their own relationships with the Crown in light of the new arrangements being offered. The king's gamble had raised the stakes for everyone involved in the constitutional debate. There could be no return to the comfortable assumptions that had governed royal Commonwealth relationships for generations. The monarchy would either emerge from the current crisis stronger and more democratically legitimate than ever before, or it would evolve into something so different that it might no longer deserve to be called a monarchy at all. October arrived with the weight of constitutional destiny hanging over not just Australia, but the entire Commonwealth and the British royal family. The referendum that would determine Australia's relationship with the monarchy was scheduled for the third weekend of the month, but by then, it had become clear that the vote would decide far more than Australia's constitutional arrangements. It would determine whether the thousand-year-old institution of monarchy could adapt to the democratic expectations of the 21st century. The months following King Charles's Australian visit had seen unprecedented changes within the royal household itself. Prince William's Reform Commission had accelerated its work, producing a comprehensive blueprint for what they termed Monarchy 3.0, a radical reimagining of royal institutions that went far beyond the initial proposals that had sparked the year's constitutional crisis. The Commission's final report, delivered to the King in early September, was a document that would have been considered revolutionary treason in any previous era. It recommended the establishment of elected royal councils in each Commonwealth realm, term limits for royal patronages, transparent auditing of royal finances by independent bodies, and, most controversially, constitutional mechanisms that would allow for peaceful transitions to republican government if public support fell below specified thresholds. But the report's most significant recommendation was also its most personal. It suggested that King Charles should consider abdicating in favor of Prince William within 5 years, arguing that the monarchy's modernization required a generational transition that would signal definitive change rather than gradual evolution. The proposal was presented not as a criticism of Charles's performance, but as recognition that institutional transformation required symbolic as well as structural change. King Charles's response to the abdication recommendation surprised everyone, including William himself. Rather than rejecting the proposal outright, the king announced that he would consider voluntary abdication if it would strengthen the monarchy's long-term prospects. The statement, carefully worded but unmistakable in its implications, sent shockwaves through the establishment and fundamentally altered the dynamics of the Australian referendum campaign. The possibility of abdication transformed public perception of the monarchy in ways that no one had anticipated. Suddenly, the institution appeared not as a stubborn defender of outdated privilege, but as an organization willing to sacrifice anything, including its most senior member, to maintain democratic legitimacy. Polling in Australia and other Commonwealth nations showed immediate shifts in public opinion as voters grappled with the implications of a monarch who would voluntarily step down to preserve constitutional democracy.
Princess Catherine emerged as an unexpected voice in the constitutional debates that followed the abdication announcement.
In a series of carefully planned public appearances, the Princess of Wales articulated a vision of modern monarchy that emphasized service, accountability, and democratic legitimacy over tradition and ceremony. Her speeches, delivered to audiences ranging from university students to business leaders, demonstrated a sophisticated understanding of constitutional theory that surprised many observers who had underestimated her political intelligence.
Catherine's advocacy proved particularly effective with younger demographics who had previously shown little interest in royal affairs.
Her argument that monarchy could serve as a stabilizing force in turbulent democracies, provided it submitted to regular democratic oversight, resonated with voters who valued both continuity and accountability.
Polling data showed that her interventions had measurably increased support for reformed monarchy among women under 40, a demographic that had been trending Republican.
But, perhaps the most significant development in the lead-up to the Australian referendum was Prince Harry's decision to return to Britain for what palace sources described as family constitutional discussions. Harry's arrival at Heathrow Airport in late September was treated as a major news event, with speculation about his role in the monarchy's future dominating headlines for days. The private family meeting that followed Harry's return lasted for 3 days and included all senior royals except those prevented by age or health from participating. The discussions, held at Balmoral Castle in an atmosphere described by participants as both emotional and businesslike, resulted in agreements that would reshape the royal family's structure and relationships. Harry's rehabilitation within the family was conditional on his acceptance of a new role as Commonwealth Ambassador, a position that would allow him to represent royal interests internationally while maintaining his residence in California and his independence from traditional palace protocols. The arrangement satisfied Harry's desire for autonomy while providing the monarchy with a representative who understood both royal traditions and contemporary democratic expectations. More significantly, the Balmoral meeting resulted in a formal agreement about succession planning that went far beyond traditional protocols. William and Catherine agreed to assume increasing responsibilities immediately, with a view to formal succession within the timeframe suggested by the Reform Commission. The agreement included provisions for regular public evaluation of royal performance and mechanisms for constitutional transition if democratic support proved insufficient. As the Australian referendum date approached, it became clear that the vote would be close enough that every factor might prove decisive. The monarchy's reform program had succeeded in shifting public opinion, but Republican arguments about the fundamental incompatibility of hereditary privilege with democratic equality continued to resonate with significant portions of the electorate. The final week of the referendum campaign saw unprecedented royal engagement with Australian media and civil society. King Charles participated in live television debates, submitted to questioning by citizen panels, and published detailed responses to written questions from Republican advocates. The level of democratic engagement was unlike anything previous monarchs had attempted, demonstrating royal commitment to accountability while risking exposure to criticism and challenge. Prince William's final campaign appearance, delivered at the Sydney Opera House to a television audience of millions, became one of the most significant speeches in recent royal history. He acknowledged the legitimacy of Republican arguments while making the case for reformed monarchy as a unique form of democratic governance that could provide stability without stifling change. But William's speech was memorable not just for its policy content, but for its personal honesty about the costs and benefits of hereditary monarchy. He spoke candidly about the privileges and burdens of royal birth, the challenges of serving institutions older than any individual, and the responsibility of adapting ancient traditions to contemporary expectations. His willingness to acknowledge the moral complexities of hereditary privilege while arguing for its potential democratic value demonstrated a level of self-awareness that impressed even committed Republicans. The referendum result, announced on October 22, was closer than anyone had predicted. The Republican proposal was defeated by a margin of 52.1% to 47.9%, but the narrow victory for monarchist forces was accompanied by exit polling that revealed the complexity of voter motivations. Many Australians who voted to retain the monarchy cited the royal family's reform commitments rather than traditional attachments to British heritage as their primary reason.
More significantly, the referendum results varied dramatically by demographic and geographic factors. Urban areas voted heavily Republican, while rural regions remained monarchist. Young voters supported Republican transition by large margins, while older demographics preferred constitutional continuity. The results suggested that future referendums might produce different outcomes as demographic change continued.
The international reaction to the Australian result was swift and consequential. Other Commonwealth nations that had been planning their own Republican transitions announced delays to reassess the implications of the monarchy's reform program. The Caribbean nations that had already transitioned to Republican status began discussing whether they might consider restored ceremonial relationships with a reformed monarchy. But, perhaps the most significant international development was the decision by several European monarchies to adopt similar reform programs. The Swedish and Norwegian royal families announced transparency initiatives modeled on the British reforms, while the Dutch monarchy established citizen advisory councils similar to those proposed by William's Commission. King Charles's response to the referendum victory was characteristically thoughtful and forward-looking. Rather than celebrating the result as vindication of traditional monarchy, he acknowledged that the narrow margin demonstrated the need for continued reform and democratic engagement. His statement, delivered from Buckingham Palace, committed the monarchy to implementing all proposed reforms regardless of the referendum outcome. More personally, Charles announced his intention to begin the transition process that would see Prince William assume increasing responsibilities over the next several years. The announcement was framed not as abdication under pressure, but as planned succession that would ensure institutional continuity while enabling generational change. As 2025 drew to a close, it was clear that the year had fundamentally transformed the British monarchy and its relationship with the Commonwealth. The institution that had begun the year defending traditional arrangements had evolved into something unprecedented, a democratically accountable hereditary monarchy that derived its legitimacy from public support rather than divine right or historical precedent. Prince William's assumption of increasing royal responsibilities was accompanied by the implementation of the transparency and accountability measures that had been promised during the reform campaign. Royal finances became subject to independent audit, patron appointments were reviewed by citizen panels, and regular public opinion monitoring was established to ensure continued democratic support. The new arrangements were not without their critics. Traditional monarchists worried that democratic accountability might undermine the stability and continuity that had historically been monarchy's greatest strengths. Republicans argued that cosmetic reforms couldn't address fundamental questions about hereditary privilege in democratic societies. Constitutional scholars debated whether the hybrid system was sustainable in the long term. But, as the year ended, polling data suggested that the reformed monarchy had succeeded in creating something that few observers had thought possible: broad public support for hereditary institution that accepted democratic oversight. The arrangements satisfied neither traditional monarchists nor committed Republicans, but it appealed to the pragmatic center of public opinion that valued both stability and accountability. The transformation of the monarchy had required unprecedented personal sacrifices from the royal family itself. They had abandoned the comfortable assumption that their position was secure regardless of public opinion, accepting instead the ongoing burden of earning democratic legitimacy through performance and accountability. Whether future generations would be willing to accept these burdens remained to be seen, but, for now, the institution had found a way to survive and even thrive in an era of democratic expectations. The year that had begun with whispered concerns about the monarchy's future had ended with the establishment of new foundations that might ensure its survival for generations to come. But survival had come at the cost of transformation so fundamental that the institution emerging from the crisis bore little resemblance to the monarchy that had existed just 12 months earlier. In saving the crown, the royal family had essentially created an entirely new form of constitutional governance, one that might serve as a model for other hereditary institutions struggling to adapt to democratic expectations, or might prove to be a unique experiment in British constitutional evolution.